So here we are again. We're going to talk a little bit now about our agenda. We will be, as I mentioned earlier, we will be taking deep dives into different passages in the books of Luke and Acts. We cannot do everything, and my purpose, and indeed it's kind of a philosophy of the Biblical Studies Department here at Azusa Pacific, is to give students tools to help them think about how to do something rather than to try to talk about everything in detail, because inevitably something gets missed. So if we can look more intently at a few passages, maybe that sets you up well as you move forward in your own analysis of the Bible or of other religious texts. We will be doing this, at least I will be attempting, and I readily concede that I'm not an RN. I live with one, as I've noted, but I'm not an RN. So my lens will be as more of a kind of a traditional biblical scholar, but that doesn't mean that it's the only lens by which we look at the text. So I'm wanting to do this in a way that keeps one eye on the text and one eye on the nursing profession and the challenges that you all are facing. I do not pretend that I will do that perfectly well, which is why we're doing kind of a team teaching approach on this, so that we can meld these disciplines in a way that's beneficial for you, the students. When I approach the biblical text and the passages that I've selected in Luke Acts, it's been with an eye on the Nursing Code of Ethics book by Fowler. So I've tried to identify passages that would, in those two New Testament books, that would most closely fit with the Fowler text. I don't claim that there's perfection on that, and I'm hoping actually that at the end of the course, when you do evaluations of the course, that maybe you'll help me think through the text chosen. Maybe you know something in one of those two books that you think, well, this might have been a better text. So I look forward to your feedback on that. So as we get started, we are going to focus our attention on, as I've said over and over again, the books of Luke and Acts. And sometimes I'll refer to them simply as Luke Acts in a hyphenated way. There's some reason for that. The scholarly approach to these two books tends to view them as a unity. That Luke is part A and Acts is part B. So Luke starts by greeting this recipient named Theophilus, which strictly interpreted means lover of God. Lover of God. And then in the book of Acts, again Theophilus appears as in the greeting. The everything that Jesus began. Interesting use of the word there in Acts chapter 1. Everything that Jesus began to do and teach, and now in the book of Acts, there's this kind of continuation, and that continuation takes place in the work and the message of the apostles. But when I refer to Luke Acts as a unity, just know that that's part of the scholarly contribution to how we think about these books. There's another reason why these two books are chosen. Within the tradition here at Azusa Pacific, students commonly take a course devoted to Luke Acts. So by focusing our attention on Luke Acts, we find that that breeds a kind of commonality between your experience and the on-campus experience for some of them are more traditional undergraduate students. I think that's going to be helpful. Maybe not, but I think it will. And I like the idea personally that there's some kind of connectivity between our professional students and our more traditional 18-year-old students. Now, I probably spent a little bit more time in my academic career looking at the Old Testament, so why do a New Testament kind of perspective? Well, the reason for that is that most people, unless they are either highly inquisitive or perhaps Jewish, most people that have any kind of connectivity with the Christian tradition are a bit more familiar with the New Testament than with the Old. So I'm trying to build on that kind of that kind of familiarity that may help you think about these texts. Plus, if we were to talk about the Old Testament, there's so many different historical phenomena and events that we'd have to keep steady in our minds. At least with the Gospels and Acts, we're talking about a compressed period of time, and I think that's helpful for us, especially in this 8-week compressed time frame. And then, certainly at Azusa Pacific, we value the gospel of Jesus, and this is part and parcel of who we are. So it's kind of natural that we would think about the gospel, and that we would think about the New Testament. So I've said we can't do everything. I've mentioned that we're going to do, 8 texts, kind of do a deep dive on those. I've mentioned that you may have other texts that you think might fit a little bit better, and that would be helpful for me. But in the end, we're making choices. Either you're making a choice or I'm making a choice. There's some selectivity involved. We're saying, or in this case, with these 8 different texts, I'm saying this one fits a little bit better than that, or this one gives me an opportunity to emphasize something that I can't emphasize quite so easily or readily or naturally in another text. So my decisions are based on, in a sense, as much information as I have at the time. In that way, it doesn't seem all that dissimilar to what you do in healthcare. Your practice areas, you're making decisions based on the available data, and when more data becomes available, that may solidify that particular decision or treatment plan, or it may cause some alterations. So that's a little bit about selectivity and why we're focused in this particular direction. One of the other things about Luke Acts that can be helpful, I think, is that the majority opinion is that these 2 books are written by the same author. I've already made some reference to the introduction in the book of Luke and the introduction in the book of Acts. Pardon me. The reference to Theophilus only occurs in both Luke and Acts. That's just one section. There's repetitive vocabulary in both. There's a reliance on the Septuagint. Some say Septuagint. I'm a Septuagint kind of pronouncer, which is a Greek translation, an early Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. You see that rather definitely in Luke and Acts. So there are some ways in which these two biblical books they kind of flow together very naturally, and then other things that I've introduced here. So what are we going to do when we're looking at Luke Acts? Well, we're going to try to think theologically, and theology certainly includes ethics and spirituality, but we're going to, big picture, try to think theologically. When we, in my discipline, think about theology, we think about divisions of theology. And you, of course, can subdivide and subdivide and subdivide. But the big areas of theology are these. Biblical studies. So that's my area. And we focus on, as you might expect, the Bible. We focus on trying to understand it as best we can with whether it's language tools or historical tools or archaeology or geography. We try to understand the text as it was as it was written. Now that's faulty. It comes with some challenges, because as you remember earlier, I talked about our lenses, right? So my lenses are limited. The things that I regard as important in interpreting the text are in many ways limited to my own perspective and the training that I've received. But as with all disciplines, the perspective and the way of doing that can change. So biblical studies, that's my particular area, and it's mainly rooted in attention to history, attention to literature, geography, archaeology, those kinds of helpful subdisciplines. Historical theology, or church history. This is a second division in theology. And as you might expect, what we do there is we think about how the tradition, from the time of the apostles to the present day, how the tradition understands the biblical text and the areas of emphases and the challenges within certain historical contexts. So there are ideas that are more important in one era and less important in another era. It's not that they're not important, it's just they're less emphasized, not as many people write about those things. But when we talk about church history, we can talk about movements within church history, we talk about areas, so we might talk about the African church, we might talk about the European church, we might talk about the South American church, and the development thereof, and the development of doctrine that comes out of those historical contexts. We talk about systematic theology, and here in systematic theology, we're trying to build a broader swath of doctrine. So theology proper, when we use that term, we're talking about what we think about God. Now, I'm a Trinitarian theologian. I think God is eternally existent as one existence in three persons. That has always been the way God was. These are eternal relationships within a Trinity, right? That's how I think about that. So when we think about theology proper, we're talking then about what the biblical text, what great thinkers throughout the history of the church have thought about that particular issue. We might talk about the Spirit. We might talk about salvation. We might talk about justice. We might talk about war, right? We could talk about all of these things within this context of systematic theology, where we try to build, and of course we disagree with one another. There's considerable conversation, but we try to build a doctrinal perspective about a thing, about an idea, about an issue. And so that's what systematics tries to do. Systematic theology, or systematics. And then, pardon me, a little bit of a cough. And then we talk about practical theology. So practical theology is, another way to think about it, at least in my mind, is applied theology, right? So what we are doing within the context of some kind of religious or Christian community. How do we go about proclamation? How do we go about education? How do we go about baptism? How do we experience and make a place for the Lord's Supper? As an example, some church communities participate in the Lord's Supper on a weekly basis. Some, it's monthly, or even less often than that. Some church communities believe in infant baptism, and there's a way in which that is done. And some church communities believe in believer baptism. So someone has to be old enough to understand the gospel and then confess Jesus as Lord and then be baptized, often by submersion, complete submersion underwater, rather than a sprinkling of some kind. So how then one takes that particular theological perspective, again, say baptism or Lord's Supper, and then gives procedure and thoughtfulness about what that is.